Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, March 17, 1944. Kensington Market, corner of Allegheny and Frankfort Avenue. Vera Callahan stood behind the counter of the dairy section for the 7th consecutive hour. Her feet throbbed in the sensible brown shoes she'd worn through 2 brutal Philadelphia winters, their leather cracked and resoled twice already. Her lower back sent sharp complaints up her spine with every shift of weight, and before her eyes flickered an endless parade of ration books and tired faces, housewives counting precious stamps, elderly men shuffling forward with trembling hands, young mothers trying to calculate whether they had enough points for both butter and cheese. The March afternoon light slanted through the store's front windows, illuminating dust motes and the desperate hope in customers' eyes when they approached her counter, asking for items that hadn't been in stock for months. When a man in an expensive charcoal overcoat approached the counter and demanded 2 pounds of butter, a near impossible request in wartime, she couldn't have imagined that 20 minutes later, her life would shatter into irreparable pieces. She'd learned to recognize the types over 12 years, the apologetic ones who understood the shortages, the angry ones who blamed her personally for rationing, the desperate ones who tried to bribe her with extra stamps or cash. This man was different. He radiated authority and contempt in equal measure. The man pulled a crumpled stack of ration coupons from his pocket, slapped them on the counter with deliberate force, and announced loudly enough for the entire queue to hear, "Count them carefully, sweetheart. You people are all the same. Short-weighing customers, pocketing extra stamps, helping yourselves to what belongs to honest Americans doing without for the war effort." Vera felt the blood drain from her face. The sensation was physical, dizzying. The line went silent. 40 pairs of eyes fixed on her. A baby stopped crying. Someone's shopping basket hit the floor with a clatter. The man continued, raising his voice so it carried to every corner of the store. Quote _1__. Vera Callahan was 37 years old. She had worked at Kensington Market for 12 years, 4,380 days of standing behind this same counter, in this same white apron, under these same fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps. She'd started in 1932, during the worst depths of the Depression, after her husband Wallace had been killed in an industrial accident at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. A crane cable had snapped. Wallace had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The foreman had come to their apartment on a Tuesday evening, hat in hand, to tell her that her husband was dead, and that the company was very sorry, but there would be no compensation because the accident had been ruled an act of God. She'd been left with a 4-year-old daughter and $17 in the bank. Before Kensington Market, she'd tried factory work at Midvale Steel. The pay was better than retail, and the war production jobs were opening up to women in 1942. But the overnight shifts were impossible with a small child and no family nearby. Her parents were dead. Wallace's parents had moved to Ohio and wanted nothing to do with her. She had no siblings, no cousins, nobody. Just Eleanor and herself against the world. Retail seemed like salvation. Regular hours, steady wages, and she could drop Eleanor at the Settlement House nursery each morning at 6:30 and collect her each evening at 5. In 12 years, she'd never received a written warning, never once shortchanged a customer. She counted every coupon twice, weighed every ounce 3 times. At night, she dreamed of ration stamps and register tapes, long columns of numbers marching across her closed eyelids. She feared mistakes with such intensity that she reconciled her drawer 4 times at closing, staying late without pay to ensure every penny matched. The store manager, Rupert Fenstermacher, had once told her after watching her recount her register for the 3rd time, "Callahan, you're too honest for this business. That's not a compliment, it's a medical condition. You'll give yourself an ulcer." She hadn't understood then what he meant. She understood now, standing frozen behind the counter while Clifton Mercer stared at her with undisguised contempt. Clifton Mercer stood before the counter with his arms crossed over his barrel chest, regarding her with the expression of a man inspecting something distasteful on his shoe. He was approximately 48 years old enough to be beyond the draft, young enough to have built a career on the opportunities that wartime shortages created for unscrupulous men. His face was heavy and remarkably well-fed in a time of widespread shortages, with drooping eyelids that gave him a sleepy, reptilian appearance and thick lips that suggested both self-indulgence and casual cruelty. His overcoat was clearly not from Wanamaker's bargain basement, but from some exclusive haberdashery on Walnut Street that catered to men who never worried about ration points or clothing coupons. The fabric was fine wool, probably English, with a subtle herringbone pattern. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist. Not the standard Elgin or Hamilton that working men saved for years to afford, but something European and expensive that would cost a working woman's annual salary. He knew his word here was law. He knew his position made him untouchable. He knew he could crush this grocery clerk like an insect, and nobody would intervene. The queue remained silent. People looked away, suddenly fascinated by their shoes or the ceiling or the shopping lists in their hands. Nobody wanted trouble with a government official, especially not one with authority over their food rations. In wartime Philadelphia, the rationing board controlled everything. Not just food, but gasoline, tires, shoes, sugar, coffee. Cross someone like Mercer, and your ration book might mysteriously disappear, or your stamps might be invalidated, or you might find yourself unable to get basic necessities for your family. People understood this instinctively. They'd learned to keep their heads down. Vera opened her mouth to explain that she'd given correct change, that she'd counted everything twice, that she'd never cheated anyone in 12 years. But Mercer didn't let her finish. He slammed his palm on the counter with enough force to make the glass scales jump and barked, "Shut your mouth! I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to your manager. Where the hell is he?" Rupert Fenstermacher arrived within 15 minutes. He materialized in the store, still wiping his mouth with a napkin, clearly interrupted during lunch at McSorley's Tavern across the street, where he spent most afternoons drinking rye whiskey and playing cards with the other small business owners in the neighborhood. Upon seeing Mercer, the manager's expression transformed instantly, like a stage actor changing masks. The alcohol-flushed irritation vanished, replaced by a smile both broad and obsequious. He advanced with his hand extended, his voice rising half an octave. "Mr. Mercer, what an honor! How can I be of service, sir?" Mercer didn't shake his hand. He let Fenstermacher's hand hang in the air for a long, humiliating moment before pointing directly at Vera and stating clearly, his voice carrying through the now silent store. "This clerk stole 3 ration coupons from me. Class A butter stamps. Government property. When I questioned her about it, she became insolent and refused to account for them. I'm demanding immediate termination. Publicly. So the rest of your staff understands what happens to black marketeers and thieves who undermine the war effort." Vera felt the floor dropping away beneath her. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely false, that for a moment she couldn't process it. She'd given him exact change and counted out his stamps twice, as she always did. She tried to object. "Mr. Fenstermacher, that's not true. I gave him exact change and the correct stamps. I always count twice. I never—" The manager raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence with a gesture that was almost violent in its abruptness. He didn't even look at her. He looked only at Mercer, and in that moment, Vera understood that the decision had already been made. She could see the calculation in Fenstermacher's eyes. One lowly clerk versus a deputy director of the rationing board. No contest. No hesitation. The manager turned to her and said in a cold, official tone that carried across the store, "Callahan, remove your apron. You're terminated, effective immediately, for systematic violation of store policy and theft of government property. Collect your final pay from the office tomorrow morning." She removed her white apron with trembling hands. The fabric was stiff with starch and smelled of bleach and the faint metallic scent of the dairy case. She'd washed and ironed it every Sunday evening for 12 years. She folded it carefully, precisely, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind screamed. The queue parted to let her pass, people pressing themselves against the shelves and display cases as though poverty and disgrace might be contagious. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. She walked through the store feeling dozens of eyes boring into her back. Behind her, she heard Mercer announce loudly, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 8, underscore, underscore. The manager laughed, a horrible, sycophantic sound that followed her all the way to the door. Vera walked out onto Allegheny Avenue. It was a bright March afternoon, unseasonably warm, with that particular quality of light that promised spring was finally arriving after a brutal winter. The sky was impossibly blue. The world was carrying on. But she saw nothing. Tears blurred her vision. Her hands shook. Her mind was blank white noise, like the static between radio stations. 12 years of work. 12 years of honest labor. Destroyed in 20 minutes. Because of a lie. Because of the whim of an important man who wanted to demonstrate his power, who needed to remind everyone that he was untouchable and they were nothing. At home, her 16-year-old daughter Eleanor was waiting. The girl was in 11th grade at Kensington High School, a large brick building 3 blocks away where 2,000 students competed for inadequate resources and overcrowded classrooms. Eleanor was preparing for her final exams before graduation, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks, algebra, American history, English literature. She'd been a good student before the war, but with teachers leaving for military service or factory jobs, the quality of education had declined dramatically. Still, she persevered. She had plans. Temple University offered modest scholarships for bright working-class girls. She'd been dreaming of college since she was 12. When Vera entered their small 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a narrow row house on Hancock Street, Eleanor immediately knew something terrible had happened. Her mother's face was gray. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd cried herself out on the walk home. Her hands shook as she tried to hang up her coat. Eleanor stood up from the table, her algebra textbook falling to the floor with a thud. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 9, underscore, underscore. Vera sat down at the kitchen table and wept. Not sobbing, not wailing, just sitting with wide, dry eyes from which tears streamed steadily, silently, endlessly. Eleanor knelt beside her chair and put her arms around her mother's shoulders, feeling how thin they'd become over the years of privation and hard work. Vera told her everything, in detail, every word. How the man in the expensive overcoat had approached her counter at 10:15, how he'd demanded 2 pounds of butter when there was barely a ½ pound available for the entire day, how she'd served him politely, counted his stamps twice, given him exact change, how he'd thrown the coupons on the counter and called her a thief in front of 40 people, how he'd summoned the manager, how the manager hadn't even listened to her side, simply fired her on the spot to please an important official. She named him, Clifton Mercer, Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Regional Rationing Board. A man who controlled the flow of food to hundreds of thousands of people. A man who could make or break grocery stores, restaurants, warehouses. A man who was absolutely untouchable. Eleanor listened in silence. She memorized that name. Clifton Mercer. She repeated it in her head like a prayer or a curse. She memorized every detail her mother provided. The expensive overcoat, the gold watch, the heavy face with drooping eyelids, the voice that commanded obedience. She was an intelligent girl, mature beyond her 16 years from growing up poor and fatherless in Depression-era Philadelphia. She understood that her mother hadn't been humiliated randomly. This wasn't bad luck or a misunderstanding. She'd been humiliated, deliberately, publicly, cruelly, to demonstrate that ordinary people had no rights, that any bureaucrat could crush you like an insect, and nobody would help. Nobody would care. The system would roll on and you would be forgotten. The following days were hell. Vera went from store to store, from market to market, trying to find work anywhere in the retail sector where she'd spent 12 years building experience. But she encountered an invisible wall everywhere she went. As soon as she gave her name, as soon as she mentioned working at Kensington Market, faces went cold. Eyes shifted away. The warm greeting turned into frozen dismissal. "We don't have openings right now. We'll call you if something comes up." Leave your information with the girl at the front." She realized with growing horror that she'd been blacklisted. Mercer had seen to that. He'd made calls, sent word through the network of store managers and district supervisors, made certain she would never work in retail again. The message was clear. Cross someone important and you're finished. Not just fired, destroyed. For a month, she lived on savings. The small amount she'd managed to accumulate over the years, kept in a coffee can in the back of the kitchen cabinet. $43. It lasted 3 weeks. Then the savings ran out. She began selling possessions. First, Wallace's pocket watch, a gold Hamilton he'd received for 10 years of service at Baldwin Locomotive. She'd kept it for 12 years, her last tangible memory of him, sleeping with it under her pillow sometimes when the loneliness became unbearable. She sold it to a pawnbroker on Frankfurt Avenue for $8. The pawnbroker knew it was worth $20, but also knew she was desperate. Then her winter coat, a good wool coat she'd bought in 1936, before the war when such things were still affordable. It was spring anyway. She wouldn't need it for months. She got $5 for it at a secondhand shop. Then, the small oriental rug Wallace had won in a factory raffle in 1928, when times were good and the future seemed bright. It was worn now, faded, but still beautiful. She got $6 for it. Then the silver picture frame that had held their wedding photo. Then Wallace's work boots. Then her Sunday dress. Then the china teapot her mother had given her. Money disappeared quickly. Eleanor watched her mother vanish along with it, watched her eyes lose their light, watched new lines etch themselves into her face, deep grooves around her mouth and between her eyebrows, watched her hands begin to shake when the rent came due, watched her start to stoop, as though carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier each day. At 16, Eleanor understood she was witnessing her mother's destruction in slow motion, and she understood who was responsible. 3 months later, in June 1944, Vera found work. Not in retail. That door was permanently closed and would remain closed forever. She took a job as a cleaning woman at Franklin Elementary School in South Philadelphia, a 40-minute trolley ride from their apartment. The pay was 58 cents an hour for 40 hours a week, $23.20 weekly, less than half what she'd earned at Kensington Market. The work was brutal. Scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, cleaning toilets, washing blackboards covered in chalk dust that made her cough, emptying trash bins in the summer heat, carrying buckets of dirty water up and down stairs. Her shift started at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after the students left, and ended at 11 at night. She came home on the late trolley, smelling of disinfectant and sweat. But there was no choice. Any money was better than no money. Any work was better than starvation. She came home late each evening and collapsed into bed without even washing. Her hands ached constantly. The harsh cleaning chemicals had cracked and blistered her skin. Her back screamed. Years of standing had already damaged it, and now the constant bending and lifting made it unbearable. But the worst part wasn't physical. The worst part was that she could no longer meet her daughter's eyes. She saw pity there. And rage. A cold, calculating rage that frightened her. Eleanor never spoke about it directly, but Vera could sense her daughter blaming not just Mercer. She blamed the entire system, the entire structure of American society in 1944, where one person could destroy another simply because he held a higher position. Where truth didn't exist. Where justice was a meaningless word. Where power was the only reality that mattered. Eleanor graduated from high school in June 1945, just as the war in Europe ended and the city erupted in celebration. The streets filled with people dancing, kissing strangers, setting off fireworks. Victory in Europe. Hitler dead. The Nazis defeated. The whole nation celebrating. But Eleanor felt nothing. She walked through the celebrating crowds, feeling numb and disconnected, thinking about her mother scrubbing toilets while men like Clifton Mercer lived in comfort and luxury. She could have gone to college. She'd been a good student despite everything. Her grades were solid. Temple University offered modest scholarships for bright working-class girls. Full tuition waived, though students still had to pay for books and living expenses. With careful budgeting, it might have been possible. But the family needed money, needed it desperately. Her mother was earning poverty wages. Surviving on one salary was barely possible. Two people living on $23 a week, paying rent, buying food, keeping the lights on. There was nothing left over. Nothing for books or trolley fare to Temple. Nothing for the future. So Eleanor made a decision. She would work. She would help support the family. College could wait. Maybe forever. Probably forever. She knew the statistics. Girls from families like hers didn't go to college. They worked, got married, had children, repeated the cycle. Still, she told herself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until her mother found better work, just until things stabilized. But she made one resolution. She would work anywhere, take any job, just not in retail. Not where her mother had lost everything. Not where she'd have to smile at customers and count their ration stamps and pretend everything was normal while remembering how easily a person's life could be destroyed. But life had other plans. In July 1945, a neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski from the second floor, mentioned that the Acme Market on Girard Avenue was hiring for their bakery counter. The work wasn't difficult. Slicing bread, wrapping rolls, weighing out cookies and cakes. The pay was decent, 70 cents an hour to start, more than her mother was making. The hours were reasonable, 7 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. Sundays off. Eleanor thought about it for 3 days. The idea of working in a grocery store made her physically ill. But they needed the money. Desperately. Her mother was deteriorating. The work was killing her. Someone had to earn more. There was no one else. Eleanor was it. She applied. The store manager, a middle-aged man named Donald Pritchard, interviewed her in his cramped office behind the meat counter. He asked about her education, her work experience. She had none. Her availability. She answered honestly. He hired her on the spot. _14, quote. It was a different store, a different neighborhood. Nobody there knew her last name. Nobody knew her mother's story. She was just another girl looking for work in the summer of 1945, when the economy was transitioning from wartime production to peacetime uncertainty, and everyone was scrambling for jobs. They gave her a white apron, a hairnet, a name tag that said Eleanor in black letters. They showed her how to operate the bread slicer, how to package rolls in waxed paper, how to use the scale, how to work the cash register. The first day she came home and cried for a long time, quietly, face buried in her pillow so her mother wouldn't hear. She cried because putting on that white apron felt like betrayal. Cried because working in a grocery store meant accepting that this was her life now. Cried because her dreams of college had just died. Her mother heard her anyway. The apartment was small, the walls thin, but Vera didn't ask why. Her mother understood everything. For nearly 2 years, Eleanor worked at that Acme Market. From July 1945 to April 1947, 21 months. 640 days of putting on the white apron every morning and standing behind the counter. 640 days of smiling at customers, slicing bread, selling coffee cakes and apple pies and birthday cakes with pink frosting. 640 days of watching the world through the lens of retail, learning its rhythms and patterns and secrets. Over those months, she learned that world from the inside. She discovered how grocery stores really operated, how the machinery of commerce functioned beneath the polite surface. She learned that everything her mother had believed about honest work and fair dealing was a beautiful lie. She watched managers write off scarce items on paper, coffee, sugar, butter, red meat, but sell them on the black market for 3 times the legal price. She watched warehouse supervisors accept bribes from delivery drivers, cash changing hands in back alleys. She watched senior clerks hide the best merchandise under counters for preferred customers. The wives of doctors and lawyers and politicians who never had to wait in line, who never had to present ration stamps, who somehow always got whatever they wanted. She watched money being counted in back rooms, money that appeared on no ledger and would never be reported to any authority. Thick stacks of bills rubber-banded together and stuffed into managers' coat pockets. She watched men in civilian clothes, not in uniform, never in uniform, though they were clearly healthy and of military age, arrive after closing and leave with boxes stuffed with cigarettes, nylon stockings, chocolate, coffee. Everything that had vanished from regular shelves, everything that ordinary people stood in line for hours trying to buy. All of it flowing through secret channels to those who could afford black market prices. She stayed silent. She just did her work, sliced bread, rang up sales, smiled at customers, made small talk about the weather and the war news and the price of everything. But she saw everything. And she remembered everything. She had her mother's gift for details, for noticing small discrepancies, for understanding patterns. She began keeping mental notes. Which managers took bribes? Which delivery companies operated off the books? Which restaurants received illegal shipments? Which warehouses stored contraband? She didn't know why she was collecting this information. She just knew it might be useful someday. She also memorized Clifton Mercer's face. Her mother had described him in excruciating detail that first evening in March 1944, and Eleanor had listened carefully, filing every detail away. Heavy face, drooping eyelids like a lizard's, thick lips that suggested cruelty and self-indulgence. Expensive clothes, always the best, always perfectly tailored. Gold watch that caught the light. The bearing of a man accustomed to command, to obedience, to getting whatever he wanted. The voice of someone who expected everyone to jump when he spoke. Eleanor had seen his photograph several times in the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Evening Bulletin. Articles about rationing efficiency, about fair distribution of scarce goods, about civic responsibility during wartime, about sacrifice for the common good. The articles were pure propaganda. In the photographs, Mercer always stood in the front row at official ceremonies, always smiling that confident smile, always looking successful and respectable and righteous. Sometimes he stood with the mayor, sometimes with generals visiting from Washington, sometimes with other bureaucrats whose job was to manage the home front while other men fought and died overseas. Eleanor stared at those photographs with a strange, cold fascination. She'd cut them out and keep them in a drawer, though she couldn't have explained why. She'd look at them sometimes at night, studying his face, memorizing every detail. Not with hatred exactly. Something colder than hatred. Something patient. She knew that someday this man would pay for what he'd done. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she believed it with absolute certainty. Justice existed. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not obviously. But it existed. And it would find him. The morning of April 8, 1947 began like any other morning. Eleanor had turned 19 in January. She still worked at the Acme Market on Girard Avenue, still put on the white apron 6 days a week, still smiled at customers and made small talk and pretended her life was normal. Her mother still scrubbed floors at Franklin Elementary, still came home at midnight smelling of disinfectant, still looked 20 years older than her actual age. They still lived together in the narrow row house on Hancock Street, still economized on everything, still counted pennies. There were no plans for the future, no dreams, no hopes. Life had become an endless repetition of identical days. Work, home, work, home. A wheel turning in place, going nowhere. Eleanor arrived at work at 7 in the morning. The April air was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of the river and the promise of spring. She punched her time card, the clock making its familiar chunk sound as it stamped 7:03 a.m., and went to the employee room to change. Put on her apron, her hairnet, her name tag. Washed her hands in the small sink with the harsh pink soap that smelled like carbolic acid. Took her position behind the bakery counter. The day began like always. The early morning customers, mostly elderly men and women who'd been awake since 5, who came to the store as soon as it opened because they had nothing else to do with their days. Then the working people, grabbing bread and rolls on their way to jobs. Then the housewives with their shopping lists and ration books and tired eyes. Eleanor served them all with mechanical efficiency. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" "That'll be 15 cents. "Thank you. Next, please." At 10:30, the morning rush subsided. Eleanor was wiping down the counter with a damp cloth, checking the inventory, making a mental note to ask the baker for more rye bread, when she heard a familiar voice. Loud, assured, accustomed to being obeyed. A voice she'd never actually heard in person, but that she recognized instantly from 3 years of imagining it. She looked up slowly, her heart suddenly pounding. Standing 15 feet away, near the manager's office, was Clifton Mercer. He'd barely changed in 3 years. Slightly older, he'd be 51 now. Slightly heavier around the middle, prosperity agreed with him. But the same face. The same heavy features, the same drooping eyelids, the same thick lips, the same expensive clothes, a dark blue suit that probably cost $60, far beyond what any working person could afford. The same gold watch catching the fluorescent light. The same bearing of absolute confidence and authority. He was talking to Donald Pritchard, the store manager, discussing something about deliveries and quotas and compliance with rationing regulations. His voice carried across the store. Other customers glanced at him nervously and looked away. Everyone recognized authority when they saw it. Eleanor stood behind the counter and watched him. Her heart beat steadily now. Her hands didn't shake. She felt a strange calm settling over her like a blanket. For nearly 2 years she'd worked in this store. For nearly 2 years she'd watched the corruption and the black market operations and the flow of illegal goods. For nearly 2 years she'd collected information without knowing why. Now she knew why. Mercer finished his conversation with Pritchard and headed toward the exit. He walked past the bakery counter without even glancing at her. To him, she was nobody, just another clerk in a white apron. One of the invisible people who served him, who existed to make his life convenient. He didn't notice her watching him leave. Didn't notice the cold calculation in her eyes. Eleanor continued her shift mechanically, slicing bread, wrapping rolls, taking money, making change, saying, "Thank you, have a nice day," in the same pleasant, meaningless tone she used 100 times daily. But her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about her mother, about how Vera Callahan had looked that March afternoon in 1944 when she'd come home in tears, her life destroyed. About the months that followed, about watching her mother sell everything they owned, piece by piece. About seeing her mother's hands shake from the harsh chemicals she worked with every night. About watching the light die in her eyes, replaced by hollow resignation. About the way her mother walked now, hunched and broken like a woman of 70 instead of 40. All because one man had decided to demonstrate his power. All because one bureaucrat had felt like crushing someone beneath him. For no reason. For sport. Because he could. After her shift ended at 4 o'clock, Eleanor didn't go home. She walked instead. Through the streets of Philadelphia. Through neighborhoods she'd never visited. Rittenhouse Square with its elegant townhouses, Chestnut Street with its expensive shops, the Parkway with its museums and monuments. She walked for hours, thinking. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The soldiers were coming home. Rationing was ending, slowly, gradually. The emergency powers that men like Mercer had wielded were being dismantled. But men like Mercer didn't disappear. They adapted, found new positions, new sources of power, new victims. Unless someone stopped them. She walked until the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple behind the city's buildings. Then she found herself standing outside a phone booth on the corner of Broad and Spring Garden. She stood there for a long time. 10 minutes. 20. Watching traffic pass. Watching people walk by on their way home from work. Thinking about consequences. about choices, about justice and revenge, and whether there was any difference between them. Finally, she entered the phone booth. The space smelled like cigarettes and old newspapers. Someone had scratched underscore underscore quote underscore 18 underscore underscore into the metal panel. She dropped a nickel in the slot. The coin made a satisfying clink as it fell. She dialed the number she'd memorized months ago from a notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The phone rang twice. A voice answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Philadelphia Field Office. How may I direct your call? Eleanor took a breath. Her voice when she spoke was steady and calm. I need to report violations of federal rationing laws and black market activity. There was a pause. Then, please hold for the duty agent. The line clicked. Silence. Then, a different voice came on. Male, older, businesslike. This is Special Agent Harlan Kowalski. You're reporting rationing violations? Yes. Can you describe the nature of these violations? Eleanor's voice was quiet but clear. Underscore underscore quote underscore 25 underscore underscore. The agent's tone shifted, became more focused, more alert. This is a serious allegation, miss. I'll need specific details, starting with the official's name. Eleanor closed her eyes, saw her mother's face, heard Mercer's voice calling her a thief in front of 40 people, made her decision. His name is Clifton Mercer, Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Regional Rationing Board. There was a long silence on the line. Then, that's a very serious allegation. Do you have evidence to support it? Eleanor had spent nearly 2 years working in grocery stores. She knew how the system worked. She knew what records existed, what trails could be followed, what patterns investigators would recognize. I can tell you which warehouses to inspect, which delivery companies to investigate, which grocery stores and restaurants received off-books deliveries. I can give you dates and times, names and addresses. But I need a guarantee first. What kind of guarantee? I remain anonymous. My name never appears anywhere. I'm just a concerned citizen reporting what I've observed. The agent considered this. If the information leads to prosecution, you may need to testify in court. Then there's no information, Eleanor said firmly. I'll hang up now. Wait. The agent's voice was quick. Underscore underscore quote underscore 36 underscore underscore. Eleanor waited. She could hear muffled conversation in the background, male voices discussing something. She waited, staring at the graffiti on the phone booth wall. Tommy loves Marie. She wondered if they were still together, wondered if love lasted, wondered if anything lasted. The agent returned. Eleanor said, for the next 40 minutes, Eleanor talked. She described everything she'd seen over nearly 2 years. Not at the Acme Market, she was careful about that, never mentioned her own employer, never said anything that might identify her. She talked about other stores, other locations, other operations she'd heard about from delivery drivers and warehouse workers and other clerks. But she'd paid attention. She'd listened. She'd remembered. She gave the agent names of warehouse managers who accepted bribes, descriptions of delivery trucks that made after-hours runs, specific dates when large shipments had arrived at loading docks after midnight, the names of restaurants and hotels that had received scarce items, whole sides of beef, cases of butter, bags of sugar, cartons of cigarettes. She described how invoices were falsified, how ration stamps were counterfeited and sold, how government officials were paid off to look the other way. She drew a picture of a systematic operation that had been running for years, that had made fortunes for those involved while ordinary Americans went without. And at the center of it all, she placed Clifton Mercer, the man who controlled the flow of rationed goods throughout Philadelphia, the man who decided which businesses received allocations and which didn't, the man who had the authority to investigate black market operations, and therefore the authority to protect those operations from investigation, the man who used that power for personal profit. When she finished, Agent Kowalski was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then she said, the agent said, Eleanor said. She hung up before he could respond, left the phone booth and walked home through the gathering darkness. The streets were quiet. Philadelphia settling in for the evening. Families eating dinner. Children doing homework. The ordinary rhythms of ordinary life. She felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no guilt. Just a strange emptiness, like she'd poured something out of herself and now there was nothing left. When she reached home at 8:30, her mother was already asleep, exhausted from another day of scrubbing floors. Eleanor undressed in the dark, climbed into her bed, and stared at the ceiling for hours while her mother snored softly in the next room. Sleep didn't come until nearly dawn. 3 weeks later, on April 29, 1947, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a front-page story with a banner headline. Eleanor read it on her morning trolley ride to work. The Inquirer cost 3 cents. She'd bought it from the newsstand on the corner without knowing what she'd find on the front page. When she saw the headline, her hands went numb. The article described a massive federal investigation spanning multiple agencies. FBI agents had executed simultaneous search warrants at 17 locations throughout Philadelphia. They'd seized business records, confiscated contraband goods, frozen bank accounts, arrested 11 individuals, including warehouse managers, delivery drivers, and restaurant owners. At the center of the scandal was Clifton Mercer, accused of operating a criminal enterprise that had diverted an estimated $3 million worth of rationed goods into black market channels over a 4-year period. The article included his photograph, not the usual confident publicity shot, but a new image. The same heavy face, but now haggard, shocked, diminished. He was being led in handcuffs from his office by 2 FBI agents. His expensive suit was rumpled. His gold watch was gone, confiscated as evidence. He looked smaller somehow, defeated, human. Eleanor folded the newspaper carefully and stared out the trolley window, watched the city pass by. The ordinary streets, the ordinary people, the ordinary buildings. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She felt nothing. The emptiness remained. Over the following months, the case developed. The newspapers followed it closely. The Inquirer, the Evening Bulletin, even the New York Times sent reporters to cover the trial. Americans were angry. Their government had asked them to sacrifice during wartime, to accept rationing and shortages, and do without luxuries for the war effort, while men like Mercer had gotten rich selling scarce goods at inflated prices. Letters to the editor demanded harsh punishment. Editorials called for investigating corruption throughout the rationing system. The federal prosecutors built a substantial case, financial records showing unexplained deposits totaling more than $200,000 in Mercer's bank accounts. Witness testimony from drivers and warehouse workers who described cash payments and secret deliveries. Physical evidence, seized shipment records that didn't match official allocations. Testimony from grocery store owners who'd paid bribes. Testimony from restaurant operators who'd received illegal goods. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, irrefutable. Mercer tried to fight. He hired expensive lawyers from a prestigious Center City firm. He claimed he was being framed by political enemies. He argued that he'd been enforcing the law, not breaking it, that any irregularities were the result of subordinates acting without his knowledge. He portrayed himself as a dedicated public servant being scapegoated for systemic problems. His lawyers attacked the prosecution's evidence, challenged witness credibility, filed motion after motion for dismissal. But the jury didn't believe him. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on 17 federal counts, including conspiracy, fraud, theft of government property, bribery, and corruption of public office. On November 14, 1947, Judge Harold Brennan sentenced Clifton Mercer to 12 years in federal prison. Eleanor read about the sentencing in the newspaper. 12 years. Mercer was 49 years old. He would be 61 when released. If he survived prison that long, Federal prisons weren't country clubs. Men died there. Men were beaten there. Men went insane there. She tried to feel something. Victory? Justice? Satisfaction? But there was only that same emptiness she'd felt since making the phone call. Her mother noticed the newspaper on the kitchen table that evening. Vera picked it up carefully, her hands cracked and red from cleaning chemicals. Looked at Mercer's photograph, read the headline and the first few paragraphs. Her hands trembled slightly. She looked at Eleanor. Their eyes met. Neither woman spoke. What was there to say? Vera set the newspaper down carefully and went to make tea. Life continued. Clifton Mercer served 10 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary before being released on parole in December 1957. By then, he was a destroyed man. His wife Helen had divorced him in 1949, citing abandonment and emotional cruelty. She'd taken back her maiden name, moved to her sister's house in Pittsburgh, and refused all contact. His 2 children, a son and a daughter, both in their 20s, had changed their names legally and wanted nothing to do with him. His health was ruined. Prison had aged him 30 years. He'd lost most of his teeth, developed diabetes. His eyesight was failing. He found work as a night watchman at a cardboard box warehouse in Camden, New Jersey, minimum wage. He lived alone in a rented room above a Polish delicatessen. 1 window, shared bathroom down the hall. He died alone on March 3, 1964, of a massive heart attack. He was 65 years old. The obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was 3 sentences long, buried on page 17. Nobody claimed his body for 3 days. He was buried in a pauper's grave with no headstone, no service, no mourners. Eleanor married in August 1950. Raymond Hollis. A decent man, quiet and steady, who worked as an electrician at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. They'd met at a USO dance in 1948. Raymond had served in the Pacific, been discharged in 1946, used the GI Bill to learn a trade. He was kind to her mother. That mattered more than romance. They married at City Hall with 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. No white dress, no church, no reception. Just papers signed and filed. They had 2 children, Dennis born in 1952, Margaret born in 1954. Eleanor quit working at the grocery store after Dennis was born, became a housewife in a small brick house in Mayfair, raised children, cooked dinners, cleaned. The ordinary life of ordinary American women in the 1950s. Her mother, Vera, continued cleaning at Franklin Elementary until 1958, when arthritis finally made it impossible to bend or kneel or lift buckets. She was 51 years old but looked 70. She moved in with Eleanor and Raymond, lived in the small bedroom upstairs, helped with the grandchildren when she could. Slowly faded. She died on January 17, 1972, at 65 years old. Heart failure. She'd been sick for weeks but refused to see a doctor, said it was too expensive, said not to waste money on her. Eleanor found her in bed one morning, cold, her face peaceful for the first time in years. At the funeral at Holy Redeemer Cemetery, Eleanor stood beside the casket and thought about that March afternoon in 1944. 28 years ago. A lifetime. She thought about the man who had destroyed her mother's life with a casual lie. About the phone call she'd made in 1947. About cause and effect and justice and revenge and whether there was any real difference between them. She felt nothing. The emptiness had never left. It had become part of her, like the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. Just there. Always there. Spring 1989. Eleanor is 61 years old. She sits on a bench in Fairmount Park watching her grandchildren play. The sun is shining. Trees are blooming, dogwoods and cherry blossoms turning the park pink and white. Children laugh and chase each other across the grass. She thinks about her daughter Margaret, who is 35 now, working as an accountant at a Center City firm, raising 2 kids in a house in the suburbs. Living a good life, A safe life. A normal life. Margaret knows nothing. About the phone call. About the revenge. About how her grandmother's life was destroyed and how her mother destroyed the man responsible. Margaret only knows that Grandma Vera once worked in a grocery store, was fired unfairly, and had to work as a cleaning lady. That it was hard. That it broke her. But she doesn't know details. And that's fine. Let her not know. It's the past. Dead. Unnecessary. Eleanor stands from the bench slowly. Her joints ache these days. Arthritis in her knees. Her back bothers her. She's become her mother. But she walks. Lives. Breathes. She outlived them all. Her mother dead 17 years. Mercer dead 25 years. Her husband Raymond died 2 years ago in 1987 of lung cancer. Too many years of smoking Chesterfields in the shipyard. She's alone now. The last witness to that story. That drama that unfolded 45 years ago in Kensington Market on a March morning in 1944. She calls to her grandchildren. Time to go home. They run to her, full of energy and innocent joy. She takes their small hands in her old hands. They walk together through the park toward the parking lot where her daughter will pick them up. She looks at their faces and wonders what kind of world they'll inherit. Whether it will be more just than hers was. Whether people will still crush each other for power and profit. Probably. Human nature doesn't change. Systems change. Names change. Technology changes. But the fundamental patterns remain. The strong dominate the weak. Those with power abuse it. Those without power endure. Or they find ways to strike back. That evening, after Margaret has collected the children and driven away, Eleanor sits alone in her living room. The house is too quiet, too empty. Just her and the silence and the memories. She turns on the television but doesn't watch it. Just stares at the wall where photographs hang. Her wedding photo, Raymond in his Navy uniform, the children when they were small, her mother, young and smiling, from before everything went wrong. She looks at that photograph for a long time, tries to remember when it was taken. 1930? 1931? Before Wallace died, before poverty, before Mercer, when her mother still believed the world was good. She thinks about Clifton Mercer, about whether he deserved what happened to him. He was corrupt. That much was indisputably true. He did run black market operations. The FBI investigation proved it beyond any doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The conviction was just. But had she destroyed him because of his crimes? Or because of what he'd done to her mother? If he'd been an honest man who'd still humiliated Vera Callahan, falsely accused her, destroyed her life, would Eleanor have found another way to destroy him? Probably. And that knowledge sits heavy in her chest. She didn't act out of civic duty. She acted out of revenge. The law was just a tool, a weapon. She used it effectively, but the motivation was personal, always personal. She wonders sometimes about alternative versions of that story. What if she'd never seen him that morning in April 1947? What if she'd walked away from the phone booth? What if she'd chosen forgiveness instead of revenge? Would her life have been different? Would she have felt less empty? Would the weight have lifted? She doesn't think so. Some things can't be undone. Some wounds don't heal. Some debts demand payment. Whether that payment brings peace or just more emptiness, that's another question. One she still can't answer after 42 years. Her mother never knew about the phone call, never knew her daughter had taken revenge. Eleanor kept that secret for 25 years while Vera was alive, and she's kept it for 17 years since Vera's death. Would her mother have wanted it? Would she have approved? Eleanor doesn't know. Vera was a gentle woman, a kind woman, A woman who believed in doing the right thing even when it cost everything. Would she have wanted Mercer destroyed? Or would she have wanted Eleanor to let it go, to move forward, to not let bitterness consume her life the way it had consumed Vera's? But Eleanor hadn't done it for her mother. Not really. She'd done it for herself. Because she couldn't bear living in a world where that kind of cruelty went unpunished. Because she needed to believe that actions had consequences. That the strong couldn't destroy the weak with absolute impunity. That somewhere, somehow, the scales would balance. So she'd made the phone call, provided the information, set the machinery of justice in motion. And the machinery had worked. Mercer had been crushed, just as he'd crushed her mother. Was that justice? Or just revenge with a legal veneer? She spent 42 years thinking about it. She still doesn't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe justice and revenge are the same thing, just viewed from different angles. The victim calls it justice. The perpetrator calls it revenge. Who's right? Both? Neither? The questions circle endlessly in her mind. Late at night when sleep won't come. In quiet moments when memory intrudes. In dreams where she's back in that phone booth, holding the receiver, hearing the agent's voice. Federal Bureau of Investigation, how may I direct your call? In the dream, she sometimes hangs up. Sometimes she speaks. Sometimes she says something different. But always she wakes up alone in the dark, in this house that's too big for one person, haunted by choices made 4 decades ago. Maybe they were all victims. The system, the times, circumstances. Her mother was a victim of arbitrary power. Mercer was a victim of his own greed and the corruption that wartime chaos made possible. She was a victim of rage and the need for revenge. They all followed their paths, made their choices, received their consequences. No fate, no destiny, just life. Ordinary American life in the middle of the 20th century. She'd taken the opportunity, made the phone call, set the machinery in motion. And the machinery had worked. Perfectly. Mercer was arrested, convicted, imprisoned, released broken, died alone. End of story. Justice served. Or was it? She closes her eyes. She's tired. It's been a long day, a long life, a long memory. She falls asleep in her chair, and she dreams of that day. April 1947. The phone booth. The receiver in her hand. The voice on the other end. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Philadelphia Field Office. And her own voice, quiet, clear, steady. I need to report violations of federal law. In the dream, the city stretches out around her. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, the birthplace of American independence, where the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, where the Constitution established justice and domestic tranquility. Beautiful words, noble ideals. But she's lived long enough to know that words and ideals aren't the same as reality. She wakes. It's 3 in the morning. The house is dark, silent. She lies in bed staring at the ceiling. Her heart beats steadily. Her mind is clear. She's made her peace with it. Not because she's resolved the moral questions, but because she's accepted that some questions don't have answers. Tomorrow she'll wake up, make coffee, read the newspaper, maybe call Margaret, maybe visit the grandchildren. Live another ordinary day in an ordinary life. The secret will remain locked inside her. The weight will remain on her shoulders. The questions will remain unanswered. And that's fine. That's just how it is. Some burdens you carry until you die. Some truths you keep until the grave. She closes her eyes again. This time, sleep comes more easily. And in this sleep, there are no dreams, no phone booths, no courtrooms, no judges, just darkness, deep and quiet, and finally, mercifully, empty. The kind of emptiness that feels like peace, or at least like rest. And for now, that's enough. All characters and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.